You're watching Jim Cantelon Today Television. This is Bible study for the 21st century. So welcome, friends. Jim Cantelon here. Always a joy, and I mean it, always a joy just to spend this little bit of time with you, mainly because I enjoy what I'm doing, but secondly, I love the exposition of the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John. I include Acts because it's part 2 of Luke, but this is what we're doing, slowly, and I hope with value added for you. Certainly does for me, because as I study, I'm teaching myself. We'll get right back to Matthew after this short break. So friends, we have finished Matthew chapter 19, and we're now starting in chapter 20. And what we've got here is a kind of mélange, as they say in French, of parable, bald-faced maternal self-interest, and miracle. It's a very interesting thing because in the middle of all that is Jesus' third prediction about his imminent death. It's really a loaded chapter, Matthew chapter 20. So let's just get to it, beginning with a labor dispute. That's essentially what we've got here, a labor dispute in verses 1 to 16. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?" "Because no one's hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers, pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you've made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I'm generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." Whoa. You can imagine what would happen these days with all of the labor unions out there and the social media, and it would be viral within minutes about this very unfair labor practice by this owner of the vineyard. Well, let's not forget, friends, this is a parable, okay? Jesus is making a point. And in any parable, he's basically making 1 point, sometimes more than one, but usually just 1 point. So, as we saw last chapter, Jesus had just summarized the life lesson from the interaction with the rich young man by declaring that many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Now, he builds on that principle with this parable about workers in the vineyard. And Peter's inappropriate question in verse 27 of chapter 19 really set it up. What's in it for us? Peter asked. What's in it for us in terms of this emerging kingdom of heaven that you're talking about, Jesus? Keeping in mind that Peter and the disciples all believed that Jesus was going to set up an earthly kingdom, throne in Jerusalem, rule the world, and they would be his cabinet. And so from time to time, they get very insecure. And Peter, at this point, is the most of the insecure. What's in it for us, basically, he's asking. Well, in the story, the laborers for hire were not Pharisees, they were not Sadducees, but they were the, as we say in Hebrew, the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. People, that the Pharisees dismissed as scum. John tells us the Pharisees said, and I quote them here, there is a curse on them. These laborers were dismissed. They were unlettered, unclean, blue-collar workers of the day. And the fact that they're standing there at a place to be hired tells you that, and I see this all the time when I'm in Africa, it's the very same thing. Guys standing, waiting for somebody to come with a truck who needs some day laborers, and will pay them a wage for the day. That's how these guys made their living. So in this case, the owner is under seasonal pressure. The harvest time for the grapes is short, and he has to get the grapes in now. So he goes early in the morning gathering, as many laborers as he can, hires everyone there at that point. He would have preferred more, but he took them all. And he makes a contract with them, an agreement. 1 denarius. And I'm not sure what 1 denarius is worth these days, but, maybe $10, $15, I don't know. But this meant that they would have to work from morning till night. So as the day progressed, the hired hands, nearly expiring in the heat, the owner went back 3 more times to the gathering place to hire more men. The size of the harvest, the shortness of time demanded as many laborers as possible. So finally, at the end of the day, the work was done. He brings the workers together and pays them the agreed wage. The men who had worked 12 hours, of course, expected more money than those who worked 6, 3, and 1 hour. Fair is fair, right? But to their outrage, the owner paid everyone 1 denarius. What? This is not fair. I'm talking to my labor rep right now. Well, the owner responded with this accusation. Responded to this accusation. Didn't we agree to a denarius? Well, yeah. Well, you got what we agreed on. The later workers also agreed to a denarius. This is my vineyard, my money, to do as I like. I've dealt with you fairly. Now, as I say, this is a parable, okay? And Jesus often starts his parables by saying the kingdom of heaven is like. Simile, right? Sometimes a metaphor. The simile here is teaching the disciples that the doctrine of merit, to which we all adhere to, is both offended and eclipsed by a sovereign's grace. We think we're earning something from God. God doesn't see it that way at all. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. God's, if you will, economy is not at all bound by the strictures of what we think is right and what we think is fair. And like the elder son in the parable of the prodigal, we demand that our faithful, long-suffering work for God gives us rank over tax collectors and harlots, as it said in that parable. We deserve more because we didn't take all of our money and go off and spend it wildly, in the pubs and the brothels of the big city. I stayed here and I worked hard for you, Father. And now you're giving this dissolute brother of mine a party? You know that parable. Well, Jesus says, no, this is how the kingdom works. The question is, what is our motive? What is the spirit of our work? Are we serving the Lord for the profit? For the benefit? Now, Jesus did talk about treasure laid up in heaven, and there's definite awareness on God's part of those who have assiduously labored for him over the course of their lives. But nevertheless, we have no input when it comes to how God, if you will, metes out his reward. So why are you doing what you're doing? You know, are you religious just to be religious? Are you a Christian because, you know, you want to benefit from Christian faith? Do you have an agenda? That's essentially what this parable is asking. And so we've got a very interesting thing here. Again, what is the spirit of our work? And Peter's question in the former chapter, what's in it for us, is totally inappropriate. Absolutely inappropriate. And I'm convinced that Jesus was a little ticked at Peter's attitude when he asked that question. You know, friends, we need to just love God and love our neighbor. That's really what we need to do. You can have any number of religious systems and protocols and dogmas and theologies and right way and wrong way of doing things. You know, it seems that every one of us is somehow a self-styled interpreter of the truth. Jesus, and we're going to get to this again very, very quickly. You want to know what God wants of us? He wants you to love him. And he wants you to love your neighbor. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. All along the prophets are there. Jesus said, no commandment greater than these. Do this and you will live. Now I'm going to, as I say, I'm going to be talking about this shortly. But in terms of the application, if you will, of this parable, we need to make sure that our motives are pure. We need to make sure that we're doing what we're doing for the sake of loving God and loving neighbor, not for the sake of gaining merit, not for the sake of, you know, getting some marks, if you will, on the blackboard to our credit. That's all wrong. And so, you know, sometimes the parables are very hard-hitting. This one is one of those. As I've read it and studied it over the years, I've been reminded again and again that it's not by works of righteousness that I have done, but according to his mercy, he saved me. That applies to me and applies to you. I'm here with Teresa Malila at the Home of Mercy, which is an entire compound now that is a real miraculous transformation from what it used to be. And we're in front of a brand new building, Teresa, that has just recently been built.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about this.
This building is the main hall, and during the cold season, we had nowhere to meet. So this is now the hall that we meet in during the cold season, but also it's a dining room. It has a kitchen, and this is the serving area you see here. It opens up. So we've had training here, quite a bit of training for counselors, for the students in the Berean, the Bible study groups, but also people who come in home-based care. We did the training here for home-based care too. So people come in here and they can learn in here, but they can also sleep in here. Because it's a sleeping facility. At night, they can use the facility to sleep. It's got a kitchen, it's got a stores, and this is a serving area. But it's very airy, as you can see. It's got a lot of windows. So even in the hot season, we can still sit in there. But during the rainy season, we don't normally have a place because the rain comes into the other hall. So this is the perfect place for us. And even the children, when they come, the survivors, this is where we sit with them.
You mentioned the survivors. It's called the Home of Mercy for a reason. We can maybe talk more about that on another segment, but you do have a number of little girls and young women who've been rescued from sexual abuse.
About 66 right now.
So they're right adjacent to this building. And they have access for feeding and all the other things you're talking about.
And we meet every Friday with them in the afternoons. since they've started school, now we're going to be meeting on Saturday.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thanks, Teresa.
You're welcome.
Let's pick it up now in, where are we? Verse 17 of Matthew chapter 20. I'm just going to read a couple of verses here. Jesus was going up to Jerusalem. On the way, he took the 12 aside and said to them, "We're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They'll condemn him to death, will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. On the third day, he'll be raised to life." Now, you can read this. Jesus went up to Jerusalem. I lived in Israel for 7 years. I know what it's like to go from Jericho up to Jerusalem. Believe me, it is a climb. I mean, I've always done it in my little Volkswagen, but, they're walking. And you're way down there, almost as low as the Dead Sea, which is the lowest spot on earth. It's hotter in Hades. There's no paved roads. There are goat paths and walking paths that some of the camel caravans used to use, but there's nothing like what we have today. And so to walk from Jericho up to Jerusalem meant hours of laborious uphill climbing. So from the Jordan Valley to Jerusalem is what's going on here. And in that very lengthy slog, Jesus and the disciples had a lot of time to talk. And Matthew here records a brief but poignant heads up from Jesus. And this is, I think, the third time he's giving them this heads up. He's warning them that things are going to happen in Jerusalem. There's going to be some serious stuff. He's going to be arrested. He's going to be condemned to death. The Gentiles, brackets Romans, will mock, will flog, and will crucify him. And then, again, something the disciples don't seem to hear, he will rise again. It's just a little transitional heads up from Jesus. But as was the case with the other two times, it's like it just kind of goes over the disciples' heads. It won't be till much later. I mean, Matthew can write about it now because he's reflecting on it. And he understands post-resurrection the meaning and the significance of what Jesus was saying here. But at the time, none of them got it. Okay, let's look at verses 20 to 28. Now, this is very interesting. All of you mothers can take note here. The mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and, kneeling down, asked a favor of him. "What is it you want?" he asked. She said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right, the other at your left, in your kingdom." "You don't know what you're asking," Jesus said to them. "Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they've been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be saved, or to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Now, in what we've just read, 2 of the 12 disciples, James and John, who are brothers, their father is Zebedee, they get their mother to present their agenda to Jesus. And my imagination goes wild when I read something like this, because I'm thinking, what preceded this? How many days, weeks, months, hours did these 2 brothers spend talking about the eventuality of finally getting their mom to lobby Jesus to give them special prominence in the coming kingdom as senior cabinet ministers? That's basically what they're asking for here. So very dutifully, they stand behind her as she kneels down before Jesus. This is a very humble supplication on her part. requesting that her two boys be the ones who sit on the right and the left of Jesus when he establishes his kingdom. Now, the right and the left, those are the two seats of honor, seats of power. Jesus will rule through them, okay? So they're going to be like president, prime minister, whatever. Like Peter, they wanted what was in it for them. They didn't have the courage, didn't have the chutzpah, as we say in Israel, to ask for it themselves. Let mommy do it. And forget this last shall be first stuff that Jesus has just been talking about. I mean, you can't be serious. We've got the inside track. We've been with him now for almost 3 years. You know, surely we're going to have his favor in this regard. Well, Jesus responds very quickly. You know what you're asking for? Really? Have you any idea what you're asking for here? Are you able to drink from the cup I'm drinking from? Of course we do. We know it. We can handle it. You know, we're tough fishermen from Galilee. Matthew doesn't tell us anything further in this conversation. What he does tell us is the other disciples, the other 10, they heard about this and were totally indignant. Now, why would they be indignant? Because they've offended Jesus? No. Because they got in there first. They wanted to ask the same thing. They all wanted to be power brokers. They all wanted to be a part of this messianic kingdom and rule the world, you know, and make a lot of money. I mean, they're human beings, right? There must have been a heated exchange between the 10 and the 2. Jesus breaks into the melee. He calms them down and then reminded everyone that hierarchical power and politics in our world do not apply to the kingdom of heaven. Service, not status, is the key to heavenly approval. So the road to greatness was paved with self-denial, not self-exaltation. Nothing wrong with being small, Jesus is saying here. Sometimes the innocuous incubates the unexpected. Remember the manger in Bethlehem? You know, the Bible says, despise not the day of small beginnings. Those of us who are followers of Jesus, those of us who've been impacted, imprinted, and indwelt by his Holy Spirit, have a worldview that calls us to the far horizon. Not that we're activists, although we may be active. Not that we're ideologues, although we may have some ideological components to our faith. But it's simply because there's something in us that wants to walk with and work for the Lord in impacting our world for good and for God. The problem is that even as we dream big, we think big. I say dream big and think small. What do I mean by that? Dream a big dream, take small steps. No huge journey is accomplished in any other way than a foot, a yard, a meter, however you want to put it, at a time. Whether you're walking or whether you're riding a horse or whether you're riding a bike or driving a car. Nothing happens instantly. And so, you know, we read the biographies of great men and women of God. We hear, you know, sermons that challenge us with their bold vision. We want to be great for God. And great in our terms usually means bigger. Bigger buildings, bigger vehicles, bigger numbers, bigger congregation, bigger. Sometimes I think we forget that Jesus had a congregation of 12. He wouldn't be writing a book on church growth on the basis of that. Now, if he had a church of 25,000, maybe he'd write the book and he'd have a market for it because we all want bigger and better. But Jesus understood something. Even though this was a small group, it was a group that was literally going to change the world. It was going to impact everyone in the world, even to this day. He didn't think in terms of big numbers. He thought in terms of big impact. I sometimes say to parents, the biggest impact you're going to have in your world is raising your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, in modeling faith and love for God and neighbor, in directing them kindly and gently to the Scripture and to the Lord. Many a parent who seems to have lived in obscurity has a child or children that have a massive impact in the world because their roots are deep, right in their mother's and father's love and Christian example. So let's not try to think more of ourselves than we ought to think, but think soberly, as Paul says, according as God has granted every man the measure of faith. Those of you who've watched JCT for a few years know that in the first few years I did interviews as well as Bible teaching. I did this because in years past I've done several television shows and radio shows that include interviews, and I love interviewing people. But I ask you the question, should I bring interviews back to the show? Or should I just stick with the Bible teaching? Well, the response has been overwhelmingly, stick to the Bible teaching, Jim. So that's what I'm doing, and that's what I'll continue to do. I really appreciate your feedback. Just keep in mind, friends, that I'm not talking down here. I'm just talking shoulder to shoulder. This camera I'm looking at right now is you. Not looking at thousands, I'm looking at one person that happens to be you. You see me with your eyes, you hear me with your ears, and no one else's. And by God's grace, that one-on-one combination can bear big fruit for the sake of God and for the sake of the love of the world. So there you have it. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with more of Matthew next time. See you later.